time I was sort of right at the Brancacci Chapel, and I didn't really get into it very far. With lots of background material and lots of discussion of Gentili da Fabriano, and probably a lot more than we needed, but nonetheless, I hope helpful for the kind of context in which we're going to be talking today. So we are at the Carmine, as they say, the Santa Maria del Carmine, in this section of the other side of the Arno, not very far from where Santo Spirito is. It's not quite the left bank, but sort of. And it's an area in which there's been a lot of scholarship about the particularly representative community that was here. It has a very broad working class base, even though, and this is true throughout Italy, it's very interesting to see how the kind of segregated neighborhoods we get in Madison, for example, are much less common in European cities. And there is, or I should speak of Italy since I shouldn't generalize for the whole continent, but in the case of this area and at this time in particular, there were wealthy living in the area, including the Brancacci, as well as a lot of working class people. And there were also two religious organizations connected, one with the Church of San Frediano, and one connected with the Carmine, and they were oriented very, very much to the care of a lot of the poor who were in this area. And this has remained of interest to historians because it seems that the Brancacci Chapel does echo this kind of a community sensibility. Part of it has to do with the themes, part of it has to do with the patron, part of it has to do with the church itself. So we are inside, and we are going to look at the Brancacci Chapel. And if you can keep in mind, right at the beginning or right at the end of the first quarter of the century, and the chronology in this first 25 years, I think you'll find extremely helpful if you can pinpoint it with certain things. Keep in mind the baptistry door competitions, those are 1401. The doors get up and running and more or less done by 1423. So they give you a kind of mirror of changes, because every time some radical new change happens, you get Ghiberti beginning to record this. He's not necessarily the one who's causing the innovations. Remember, those go on especially at San Michele, that grain hall, guild-funded building in which each of the guilds was to put its patron saint. First it was in a painted pier inside, and then it was in a sculptural program on the exterior. And that's where the competition among the sculptors really does pay off, because that's where you first begin to see Donatello being new and radical, Nanni di Banco also, Ghiberti shuffling like crazy. He does first the great John the Baptist, and then he sees these radical changes, and by the 20s, with St. Stephen and St. Matthew, he's beginning to show changes. He never completely buys into the new ideas, but he clearly is registering them. So these things are important, and then remember the date 1417, I think, is a useful date, because by this time we've got Donatello doing the relief sculpture below George with the St. George killing the dragon and protecting the princess. You get this indication of a spatial depth that we haven't had before, and this seems to be related to Brunelleschi's development of single-point perspective, at least the theory, by probably 1417. So keep in mind that that's the background. Painting is slower, and Gentili is the most innovative, coming in with the entourage, basically, of Pope Martin V, who has just been elected at the Council of Constance, is making his way to Rome, stops in Florence. And while Gentili is in Florence, remember, he's painting. In fact, he's busy, so busy that the Brancacci, should they have wanted to ask him, can't get him, because he's just so busy working for a whole variety of other people, starting from the very time that he arrives, to paint these very sophisticated paintings that are largely reflective of the International Gothic, but have already been paying attention to some changes in handling of space, clearly careful recording of an emotional response between, for example, the Madonna and Child in several instances I showed you, and a very rich reflection of the textile industry. If you look at the weave and the garments, particularly of the Virgin Mary, of saints, of the hangings behind her, they're very rich fabrics. So that's our context. And we have the commission here of a painted cycle with now today an 18th century ceiling up above. We've lost the original window, although the restoration has showed us the original probably column supporting a split of a bifurcated window, and it would have gone clear down to that lower level, and it's that natural light that we see indicated in the painting of the chapel. So the restoration that goes on in the 80s, that I'll talk about a little bit more, is very helpful because the chapel had been redone in the 18th century. It was dirty. There had been a lot of candles burned in this chapel, and so it was really dirty and damaged as well. So the original window would have been much bigger, and I'll talk more about the restoration. There is a medieval Byzantine icon here that apparently had been in the church elsewhere and was moved here into the chapel at one point in the 15th century. Kristen Gardner from Teufel talks about it quite a bit in an Itachi conference that I was remarking about last time. But we're going to be primarily interested in the frescoes, and they were, it seems, initially commissioned from Masolino. I mentioned these two artists last time. He's the small Tom, remember? And in this particular instance, it's debated whether Masaccio came on board as an assistant or whether he comes on as pretty much a full-scale partner. It's hard to know, but he appears in that first year that Masolino is painting. Their artistic styles differ considerably, and I think you'll be able to tell. And I will talk about the details on it as we go along. The chapel is also dedicated to St. Peter, as we will see, and that makes a difference. There's been a lot of discussion about why Peter. Peter is deeply associated with the papacy in Rome, and it's true that the Florentines were largely Guelphs. They were largely supporting of the papacy as opposed to the Holy Roman Emperor. But Peter may be important for a variety of reasons, and those have been discussed very interestingly by a number of people. So we've got a double level of frescoes, and they're a bit complicated to keep apart. Most of them deal with the story of Peter, all the way to his eventual death over here, and earlier on you see him imprisoned, and then he gets out with the help of an angel. This lower group are done in the 1480s by Filippino Lippi, who completed the chapel, because in the 20s, Masolino gets drawn away to Hungary, where he's painting, and then he comes back, and he and Masaccio both go to Rome. They paint some projects in Rome, as we'll see, one for the Pope. And so the chapel is left undone. And Felice Brancacci, our patron, himself is exiled from Florence. The political rivalries that went on were vicious, and I'll talk about those a lot more later on. So Masolino does, and we're going to look at this especially, this upper level, starting, interestingly enough, with Adam and Eve. Seems odd. There's been a fair amount of discussion about that too. So Adam and Eve, and then the cycles dealing with Peter, The altar wall area over here is done by Masaccio. And so slightly after the frescoes are begun. The other side, with the expulsion of Adam and Eve, and here we see Peter in prison, so the paired Adam and Eve are very interesting to compare and contrast. And then we've got Masaccio's most famous painting up here, and then one over here by Masolino. Whether this was the first one he did is hard to say. This one is by Masaccio, and we're back to Filippino Lippi completing things over here on this side. So Filipinos are the lower level, broad wall paintings, and Masolino and Masaccio do the others. Let me show you this kind of odd photograph here, and it's not terribly clear, a kind of collage putting together of the two walls without the altar area, which were restored in the 1980s. I was lucky enough to go up on the scaffolding and hear this uproarious argument going on between my friends who were from Rome and were the restoration people and experts, a friend of mine, historian who worked at the Restoration Center in Rome, and the team that were restoring things from Florence. There were different policies about how you did things. And when I come to this, I'll tell you, because this was what the argument ensued about. In any case, you've got this whole cycle that is quite complex and which the restoration teams really did rescue. Now, before we go very far, we haven't talked about the medium of fresco, and I cannot emphasize enough that the effects of what you see in fresco are very, very different than what you see with a panel painting done with tempera, particularly with an egg yolk base and paint color on a prepared panel, a series of panels. The paint in tempera is much more saturated. It's a brighter result. It's got very often a very shiny surface, very intense colors, as in the case of Gentile da Fabriano, whereas fresco is actually painted on plaster, wet plaster. It's like making pasta or mayonnaise. You have to get that plaster to a certain point, and it's very hard. You have to just do it by practice. It's sort of like knowing when after you keep beating that olive oil into the egg yolk, you know eventually it will coalesce and create mayonnaise. And so you get good at knowing just about when it's going to happen. So in the fresco, you've got the regular wall, and then you get plaster covering that wall and the stones, the arriccio, and that's put on, and then there are the intonico layer, which is this final smooth coat on which you then apply these pigments. And it's not really wet, it's damp. It can't be too wet, it can't be too dry. And so what you get is this chemical bonding of the color into that plaster as it finally dries. So it's a very tough medium. However, it's also susceptible to water seepage from behind. You can imagine water coming through the stones and getting into these basic supports. Then it's a problem, particularly if there's salt stored. And that was the case in Siena, in the Palazzo Pubblico. The salt was controlled by the commune, and there was salt stored behind some of Simone Martini's most important paintings. And so that damp wall absorbed all that salt, and boy, what a mess. So you've got the painting on this plaster, and you have very often, though not usually extensive, drawings right on the plaster. What is called the synopia, and it's usually a kind of charcoal, and so it's easily covered up. It's hard to keep it when you're restoring things, although restoration's gotten so good that you can peel off this paint just like you pull off a Band-Aid, and you reveal the chalk drawing underneath. Yeah, it's just miraculous what they've been able to learn to do. So you mix your pigment of all these different minerals, and you put it in a kind of liquid base and painted onto this damp plaster. And each time you work on a section, what's called a day's work or a giornata, you can tell, you can see on the plaster, you can see where each day has been done. And so restoration teams will say, oh, well, it took 7 giornati, 7 days to paint this. And obviously assistants can do the drapery and the broader kind of things, and then the master often does facial things in all of this. So you'll be able to tell difference because the paint surface is more matte. It's duller. It's a kind of handling of the surface. And here you can see a giornata. This one's very clear because there was a fire here in the 18th century, and that smoke left its traces, and so it exposes these giornati more clearly than they might have. The restoration team removed things like overpaint in dry fresco, and that can be removed fairly easily because there was a whole preference for modesty at this point, and so these were put on and they've now been removed, and you can see if you take off those layers of dirt that you can begin to see the highlighting here, the way that in this case, this is Masaccio, is showing the relationship between this figure and the window, because if I go back up here, well, you can't really see there, can you? Maybe you can a bit here. The window is right over here, and so the light is directional, and he's paying attention to that. You can see the light is being indicated by the lighter value, the lighter pigment used, or in this case, the light as if it were in fact coming from that direction. So how much window was available was a very great, interesting point that the restorers wanted to make clear. Another indicator of what happened with the restoration was the clearer presence of what looked like piers, striated piers, of the kind that we saw Brunelleschi use in pilasters, you'll remember, such as at San Lorenzo, on the wall with columns on the aisle. And this seems to have been used to suggest the support of the flat entablature here for the frescoes, separating one layer from another. This had actually been done in the 14th century, so it's not an unusual indicator, but its presence here wasn't entirely known, nor was the continuation of landscape. And here in this corner, you can see that there are a little bit of mountainous areas visible at the edge of this fresco, and then they just continue right over here in this one. Now, this is Masaccio, and this is Masolino. So I'll come back to this. It may well have been one of his earliest pieces. The area around the altar was also cleaned, and this revealed some extremely interesting material, including a decorative kind of frame, and apparently 2 small frescoes that were originally here before this panel was installed. And there are 2 little heads, one on either side, and critics, as you might imagine, argue fiercely over who painted those. And I don't want to go there. I think it's tough to tell. You have to be really good at this. Whether one is more convincing than the other, is one Masolino and the other Masaccio, who knows? And who are they? And why are they there? We just don't know. The areas that were destroyed, that are now behind that panel but were exposed in the restoration, are some of the Sinopia. You can barely see here. It seems to show that St. Peter, remember, Peter denied knowing Christ at a very crucial moment. And so Peter is a sinner, and he's a kind of redeemed sinner. And then, of course, Christ picks him to succeed him, as it were, to become, as it were, the first pope. So here's Peter in a seated position here in this charcoal drawing. That's one of these Sinopia. And the other one seems to be to feed my sheep, which is another very famous episode of Christ. And you can't really tell much, except you can kind of see these sheep down here on the side. There's debate about how extensive that was, but in any case, the restoration team really did a good job. And then there are the colors, which are retrieved in large part. Not everybody liked the restoration, but most people have. So I do want to start with Masolino, and then we'll get to Masaccio, and if I get behind again, I will catch up eventually. Let me start on that altar wall area that we just saw up here with Peter preaching. And I don't want to spend much time on this, but I presume you can see where we might have some portraits and we might not. There's a kind of generic type, this figure perhaps, or this one, and maybe this one or this one, but can you see the more individual features on this face? Does that make sense to you? A little bit more distinctive, more individualized, and he's also got on this sort of black hat that is typical at the time. Remember, we are with some Carmelite monks. We'll have more to say about those Carmelite monks later. They're supposed to stay in a monastic situation, but they had a real renegade among them later in the century, Fra Filippo, Filippino's father. Carmelites are not supposed to have children, so that's another whole story. But these are, this one especially seems to be fairly individualized, so it may well be that these are portraits. She also is fairly distinctive, and here in a nun's habit, we don't quite know about that. Peter himself seems to conform to the usual type of Peter, who's a fairly big man with curly white hair and short curly white beard. He often wears a yellow and blue outfit. It doesn't quite look yellow and blue, but sort of here. And then we've got another pair also wearing those darker hats that also seem to be individualized. And whether these are members of the Brancacci family or whether they are some of these community friends, it's hard to know just who we're talking about. Remember that the landscape is also this kind of generalized hill. We'll talk more about it. The light is clearly stark on Peter, and of course he's standing right next to the window. The presence of portraits fairly early here in the 15th century is helpful, and we'll see more and more portraiture develop. It's not new in the 15th century, but it's infrequent, and so it will be important for us. Masolino shows two miracles that Peter performs, and both of them are indicative of the good work that he did, and lots of people argue that this is where you begin to see echoes of this community around the Carmine. And I'll talk more about the space behind, but here you have a fairly interesting spatial indication. Now, if this is Masolino, he seems to be handling perspective a little bit. Some have said, well, maybe it's Masaccio doing the background. We don't really know. This is more convincing in terms of recession, spatial recession, than that Annunciation of the angel to Mary that I showed you last time. That's a fairly early Masolino. But our arcade seems to be angling back, and that's continued in the buildings behind. An open space here, some of it paved and some of it not. Some have argued that this is right there around the Carmine. It's hard to know. The miracle of the raising or the healing of the cripple is an interesting one where it's the cripple wants money, and Peter reaches out as the man thinks he's going to get some money, and then of course Peter doesn't give him money. He tells him to get up, and of course the man is truly crippled and can't get up, and so it's the miracle of Peter being able to to bring this man to full strength. And so that's what's going on here. And then over here, this is Tabitha, and she has just died. And Peter raises her from the dead, which is why she looks deathly pale, very, very white. And as she sits up here on this small bed with her garments being held over here by a couple of the nuns, everybody is showing their astonishment. And the man who's standing right next to her apparently originally had a much richer outfit on, and the restoration has showed at least a kind of marking on the textile, as he too is quite astonished. So here are these two miracles due to faith that Peter has brought about. And then we have our two dandies right here in the middle, and they're of great interest to us as well. Here just quickly, so you can see the bent leg and the poverty-stricken locals, of whom there were a number, or here Tabitha. And then the dandies in the middle are here, and remember this is a little bit of repetition, but that Felice Brancacci was a silk merchant, and he was also part of the Wool Guild. And we've already seen Gentile, but also Masolino pay a lot of attention to the expensive garments that were being produced. And here again, we see two contemporaries wearing contemporary fashion. These look less like portraits, it's hard to tell. The younger individuals are, the less individualized it seems. So whether we got portraits, it's really hard to say, but they certainly do reflect fashionably dressed men. Eventually Leon Battista Alberti, who's going to be of great interest to us, says that people should walk with a certain amount of sprezzatura. Sprezzatura is a wonderful term of which you cut kind of a panache. A friend of mine was describing a woman that her father was recently dating, and she did a wonderful strut, and it was exactly what you think these two guys are going to do. And his hose, and remember it's the men who show their ankles, is the hose matched the hats in both cases. And of course, in this instance too, the kind of fabric perhaps that Felice Brancacci would have in fact made available either through importation or manufacture right there in Florence. There is a fair amount of light attention here. Remember, our light is coming from our left. So this pink is a higher value in the front. And we saw with Lorenzo Monico how much more intense that pink would get in the shadows. I would argue that Masolino has a more subtle indicator here of the color change than Lorenzo Monico, although in principle it's not all that different. There is also a great deal of careful observation about the living circumstances in the community. You hang your bed sheets out the window. There's a long, complicated practice of doing that. When I first lived in Europe, we didn't put our sheets out the window. We discovered that people were very suspicious. You're supposed to air out your linens. On the other hand, if you wash them, you also can hang them on the bar that is projected out from the windows, and that's also where you could put plants. And to this very day, friends have all kinds of marvelous plants that grow all winter long. Cyclamen, for example, you see in the markets these days grow on windowsills in the wintertime. Or if you've got a family bird and he gets tired of being inside, you can hang him on this bar, and he can chirp his heart away out there without leaving your household. You can see that there's a lot of marking on the walls and plaster here, so that the background and the mathematical grid that the perspective would have required is visible in some of this. We also see that the bottom level of these palaces tend to be graded and covered up, whereas most of the population live on what the Italians call the first floor. And I've come back from Europe more than once and pushed the elevator to floor 1 and discovered, of course, here we call the ground floor number 1 usually, and then the elevator doesn't work. So People live up here above, and sometimes this is storage, sometimes it's business, and very often servants will live on the top floor because they have to walk up the furthest. And here again you see the angle, and there are a fair number of houses that would have been supported on these kind of stilts. So the observation of the neighborhood and the living style in the neighborhood seems to be quite present. Now, if we look at Masolino's handling of Adam and Eve, you begin to see that there is a limited knowledge of the human body, particularly for the women. And if you contrast it with Jacopo della Quercia's relief sculpture that we saw in Bologna, you'll see that there's, particularly in the case of the male figure, though some of this is stereotyped in the musculature, it is a much more convincing kind of body, in a way, than Adam. And remember here that we have the tree of knowledge and the fig tree, and of course we've got the evil tempter here of Eve, who wants her to eat an apple from over here, and of course she's not supposed to do that, and she does so, and then offers it to Adam. And so that's the beginning of the fall of humankind that is going to need Peter, and is going to need this belief in the afterlife and the belief in Christ to justify this whole problem. So the religious significance of Peter's preaching and Peter's miracles is partly prompted, of course, by the fall of Adam and Eve. So in a sense, Adam and Eve's temptation and expulsion from paradise are the beginning of the human condition and problems that religion is supposed to heal. The expulsion by Masaccio is a very different handling, and this is always, it strikes me, slightly unfair, but you really do see how much better Masaccio handles the nude. And how that happened and why he does this is a topic of endless discussion. We've got St. Michael driving them out of paradise, which is sort of treated like a city gate here, and Eve realizing that suddenly she is nude, a problem she hadn't recognized, of course, in paradise, covers herself up and has this just howl of anguish on her face. Adam covers his face up as you see him sort of striding out here, still that muscular figure that we seem to have had with Jacopo della Quercia. Well, if you look at the expulsion, it's not as radical as Jacopo's was. Remember, he twisted Adam all around, although there's some similarities to Eve. The real prototype for Adam, it would seem, is a classical sarcophagus that was actually in Pisa. It's something that, in fact, could have been quite well known because it was in the Campo Santo, and it was available for anybody to see who got to Pisa. And it's a Roman sarcophagus, and if you look at the shoulders here and this striding figure, we do know that increasingly the study of antique prototypes, remember we had in Brunelleschi's competition panel that young man pulling a thorn from his foot, or we had that stunning torso by Ghiberti. So the study of classical models is already underway. We know Donatello and Brunelleschi did that on their trip to Rome. So it wouldn't have been unusual for Masaccio to have done that, and many do believe that that is what is the source here. And of course, we've already seen the contrapposto and the new sensibility about the human form that Donatello used in his figure here, St. Mark, and compared with the Doryphorus. And so here you get more of the whole sarcophagus over here. So very interesting continued confirmation of the role of classical antiquity in what these new changes are all about. Now, as Masaccio takes over and begins to do compositions, you see this handling of the nude in other places. most wonderfully here where this is now Masaccio, where Peter baptizes the neophytes. And so we've got this very convincing muscular figure kneeling here, the window being to our left because this is where this takes place. And then this fellow who is really cold, doesn't want to take his clothes off and get in this river. And so you see this kind of process over here. And again, what apparently are portraits observing fairly early handling of that, and those anonymous kind of mountains in the background, they look like the chocolate hills in the Philippines. And here you can see how he's handling the light. The head looks slightly small, bent that way, but it may also be the angle of the photographer. The most memorable of all, really, is the tribute money, and I want to be sure and get to that. We have some other things to talk about today, too. This is really Masaccio's triumph here. It usually gets into every survey class in one way or another. And it is one of these that does capture all in one the innovations of this period. Now, if I were to show you this on an exam, this is how I want you to be able to use what you're learning. For example, you've got a group of people here. They're the apostles gathered together with Christ because our situation is described in the Gospel of Matthew. Christ arrives at Capernaum, or here up by the lake of Galilee, and a tax collector comes around and says, "You can't preach here without paying a tax." And it's a long and complicated situation, but Christ says to Peter, "Well, go over here, and the first fish you catch will have the money you need." So what we have is a continuous narrative, really. We've got different episodes of this story. And Peter pays off the tax collector. So tax collector appears twice. Peter appears 3 times. Christ is here once. Now, if you were to talk about this, and you'd say, this is innovative because it's taking into account these new ideas that I just kind of summarized. So what works of art could you cite right now that would reinforce a precedent for you in arguing that this takes into account all these new innovations and applies them in this particular wonderful kind of story? What can you draw on? What would be one point that you make? Anybody? Where to begin? Yeah.
Maybe the landscape in the background.
All right, we can certainly start with the setting. Not a bad idea. And what would you say about the landscape?
I think it's pretty dramatic in comparison to
All right, it's dramatic. But if you want to think about what innovations we've seen in landscape and what example you've got in mind that maybe you've taken the time to learn, could you say, well, it's like this in order to illustrate what idea? You see where I'm going with this? You're right. It's a more dramatic landscape. Some help for you over here. Yeah.
The back of the mountains, like the farther part, look fuzzier and less detailed, kind of like the flatter relief. Like
Okay.
maybe farther away, so like less detailed.
Okay, the flatter relief looks what?
Especially with St. George and the Dragon.
Okay, George and the Dragon, and who is it by?
Donatello.
Donatello. Okay, good. Donatello's relief of George and the Dragon shows. Now, what term can you use? You're right, it's lighter. What's he doing here? He's applying what idea? You're right, absolutely right. If you get your terms, you can shorten those long descriptive narratives, right? And then you can write more. So what you want to do is what is he What is he accomplishing here? He's gone lighter. This is lighter than this. This is darker.
Atmospheric perspective.
All right, it's atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective. He's using perspective. So for spatial depth, remember it's single point perspective, and that's accomplished spatially in a variety of ways that we'll get to in a minute. But this is a kind of special atmospheric effect in the relief sculpture. How did Donatello accomplish that? Do you remember the term we used? Schiacciata. Good for you. Schiacciata, that flattened out stuff, no leavening. Remember, like the bread in the pre-Easter season, as it were. Okay, so Donatello accomplished that with Schiacciata in the low relief of the St. George and the Dragon. Here, in order to accomplish the same thing with landscape, Masaccio has lightened the background because in the distance things get lighter and faded out. Spend some time, looking out more toward a landscape if you could get there and see what happens. So we've got this atmospheric or aerial perspective. Good, and then the single point perspective is also visible here, as it was in that same relief. So we can draw on Brunelleschi's idea. Where can you see that?
We'll see a vantage points are pointing towards Jesus from the building.
I'm sorry.
A vantage point, like that aims a little bit towards Jesus.
Okay. Well, what we have with this building, and it's easier to work with architecture than almost anything else, you've got this building angled according to the orthogonals, those diagonal lines. Yes, that, if you can draw them, would sort of be headed towards the center here with Christ in the middle. Is that what you mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's the orthogonals. Can you use the terms? Orthogonals will keep you from having to describe in great detail the angle of the building. They can get very wordy. So use for me the idea that single point perspective as well as aerial perspective is here, as you can see from the angle of the architecture, just the way Donatello did it behind the princess, in that loggia behind the princess. So do you see where we're going with this? Yes, you were absolutely right. That landscape is believable because, and you also could talk about the diminishing size of the trees, because they're bigger in the foreground and they diminish as they go back in space. So that too would be useful. Okay, good. Now what else? Yeah.
Very little use of bucket folds.
Okay, we don't have many bucket folds, and if we do, they seem believable, don't they, in terms of the heavier material. It isn't just fashionable angles and dips, but it seems to be, because these are all dressed in sort of late antique, early Christian garments that we associate with this period of Christ. Okay, no bucket folds, but instead of going for the negative, what have we got as a positive? You're absolutely right. And what do we have that necessitates no bucket folds now? What have we got? Anybody? Yeah.
Maybe he wasn't inspired by classical Gothic style?
Well, he's not inspired by classical Gothic, but think about what he is inspired about. Go after the positive. And we're talking about prototypes now. Where have we seen a group before with no beard and short hair and heavy drapery in a group that gathers around, in this case, Christ? Where have we seen a group like that before? The old building. What group? You got an idea? The four saints, you're quite right. Not tetrarchs, but the four saints, the four crowned. What happens to these Christians in the late antique period? Starts with an M. Four crowned saints, four crowned martyrs. Okay, the four crowned, the quattro coronati, the four crowned martyrs. Okay, and who's our artist for that?
Nani di Banco.
Nani di Banco. Good. All right. We've got Nani di Banco's group of four crowned saints at Orsanmichele. The date works. It's earlier, right? it's earlier than this. This is in the 20s, and those are already done. So you can say, well, it's not exactly like that, but it's similar, not unlike those really believable four saints that Nani Dibanco puts there in that niche, including particularly this one. It's got this square chin and this short hair, and that too has drapery that's not the bucket folds, but more believable because those are three-dimensional, big, heavy men, and they're wearing real robes, so it seems, because they're so believable. All right, do you see where I'm going with this? You learn the individual projects, and you learn what's innovative about them. And then in a case like this, if I give you the right examples, I often will choose things that I know you can bring to bear a variety of works of art for which I can give you credit. Because every time you mention one of these, you mention an artist and what the work is, I can give you a point for that. And pretty soon you're racking up points. You decided Donatello's St. George and the Dragon. You've got the Four Quattro Coronati. You've got Single Point Perspective by Brunelleschi, which you know he's already done by 1417. Do you see where I'm going with this? You want specific evidence to back up your argument, and your argument isn't just descriptive, it's the ideas that are being generated and what's going on. Now, another factor here that we haven't talked much about is the powerful role of gestures. After all, painting, in a sense, is a visual rhetoric. And the whole art of rhetoric coming out of classical antiquity is to persuade you to stand up in front and howl at you like crazy. So, and I suppose online these days you can still do the same thing. But look at the gestures here. Christ is pointing, and Peter says, "You mean right over there?" I mean right there. Right over there, right over there. So they're pointing, and the tax collector, "I want my money right now." Right now, he says. He's pointing down with his finger. He's got his hand out. He wants that money. So the gestures are telling you this story. You don't have to sit and read the passage from Matthew. I mean, maybe you don't know it's Capernaum, where he's from, but you know that he wants something, and it's something that Peter gets out of the mouth of the fish over here and then pays the guy off and leaves. So it's this kind of handling of your material that gets really fun, and then you can do this whole thing. Well, it looks like I have managed to get us clear to a quarter of. So I am behind. Here are Quattro Coronati, and you can see especially, let me just say, if you go back and really look at this guy, he's very much like that. And let me just conclude by saying that when I was up on the scaffolding with this team of restorers, they hadn't yet come up with a solution quite for these halos, tipped and seen in perspective. And the team I was with didn't like the way the Florentines had handled the halos, and said, you can't. In fact, Eve Borsuk was with us, and she's a major scholar, and she said, they look like loaves of bread. She said, you can't paint them that way. And there was this horrendous argument, and so they have finally gotten them so that they look like discs that are floating in perspective and at an angle. All right, read away over the weekend. I will speed up and get us up to where we need to be next week. And go see the exhibition next door.
I just saw an interesting article about St. Mark that caught my eye. Yeah, the author's claiming that there's a...
You mean St. John?
St. John,
yeah.
Right. The author's claiming that there's enough similarity in the eye shape of
self-portrait?
in St. John and a self-portrait, yeah.
Oh, goodness sakes. Who's making this argument, I wonder?
I don't know, it's just like a blog, so it's probably not like a peer-reviewed like argument or anything, but it just caught my eye. I thought it was kind of interesting.
Oh, it's fun. Well, it's certainly true that Michelangelo is not the first. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm not sure I buy it. What do you think?
Well, it's a bit of a you just used the phrase today. It's a bit of a kind of general face structure. So
Yeah.
when they're that general, there could be
Well,
could be
and
said to be-
Italians, a lot of Italians have really big big eyes.
Mhm.
You've got big eyes, sort of. But I mean, it's not exactly a cliche, and so repeating those, he looks much more squinty-eyed there,
Mhm.
doesn't he? But it's closer with the other one.
I have read, I think it might have been Alberti who said it's a natural tendency of painters and sculptors to lean towards their own
Well,
defects.
that's probably true. Well,
yeah.
and you're always in front of something that can magnify your image, and so
Mhm.
you're there, and you don't have to go get somebody. So that's probably how they